Chapter 31 of Barnaby Rudge, A Tale of the Riots of '80. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recorded by Mill Nicholson. Barnaby Rudge, A Tale of the Riots of '80 by Charles Dickens. Chapter 31. Pondering on his unhappy lot, Joe sat and listened for a long time, expecting every moment to hear their creaking footsteps on the stairs, or to be greeted by his worthy father with a summons to capitulate unconditionally and deliver himself up straightway. But neither voice nor footstep came, and though some distant echoes, as of closing doors and people hurrying in and out of rooms, resounding from time to time through the great passages and penetrating to his remote seclusion, gave note of unusual commotion downstairs, no nearer sound disturbed his place of retreat, which seemed the quieter for these far-off noises, and was as dull and full of gloom as any hermit's cell. It came on darker and darker. The old-fashioned furniture of the chamber, which was a kind of hospital for all the invalided movables in the house, grew indistinct and shadowy in its many shapes. Chairs and tables, which by day were as honest cripples as need be, assumed a doubtful and mysterious character, and one old leprous screen of faded India leather and gold binding, which had kept out many a cold breath of air in days of yore, and shut in many a jolly face, frowned on him with a spectral aspect, and stood at full height in its allotted corner, like some gaunt ghost who waited to be questioned. A portrait opposite the window, a queer old grey-eyed general in an oval frame, seemed to wink and doze as the light decayed, and at length, when the last faint glimmering speck of day went out, to shut its eyes in good earnest and fall sound asleep. There was such a hush and mystery about everything, that Joe could not help following its example, and so went off into a slumber likewise, and dreamed of Dolly, till the clock of Chigwell church struck 2. Still nobody came. The distant noises in the house had ceased, and out of doors all was quiet, save for the occasional barking of some deep-mouthed dog, and the shaking of the branches by the night wind. He gazed mournfully out of window at each well-known object as it lay sleeping in the dim light of the moon, and creeping back to his former seat, thought about the late uproar until, with long thinking of, it seemed to have occurred a month ago. Thus, between dozing and thinking, and walking to the window and looking out, the night wore away. The grim old screen and the kindred chairs and tables began slowly to reveal themselves in their accustomed forms. The grey-eyed general seemed to wink and yawn and rouse himself, and at last he was broad awake again, and very uncomfortable and cold and haggard he looked in the dull grey light of morning. The sun had begun to peep above the forest trees, and already flung across the curling mist bright bars of gold, when Joe dropped from his window on the ground below, a little bundle and his trusty stick, and prepared to descend himself. It was not a very difficult task, for there were so many projections and gable ends in the way, that they formed a series of clumsy steps, with no greater obstacle than a jump of some few feet at last. Joe, with his stick and bundle on his shoulder, quickly stood on the firm earth and looked up at the old maypole, it might be for the last time. He didn't apostrophize it, for he was no great scholar. He didn't curse it, for he had little ill will to give to anything on earth. He felt more affectionate and kind to it than ever he had done in all his life before, so said with all his heart, "God bless you," as a parting wish, and turned away. He walked along at a brisk pace, big with great thoughts of going for a soldier and dying in some foreign country where it was very hot and sandy, and leaving God knows what unheard of wealth in prize money to Dolly, who would be very much affected when she came to know of it; and full of such youthful visions, which were sometimes sanguine and sometimes melancholy, but always had her for their main point and centre, pushed on vigorously until the noise of London sounded in his ears and the Black Lion hove in sight. It was only 8 o'clock then, and very much astonished the Black Lion was to see him come walking in with dust upon his feet at that early hour, with no grey mare to bear him company. But as he ordered breakfast to be got ready with all speed, and on its being set before him gave indisputable tokens of a hearty appetite, the lion received him, as usual, with a hospitable welcome, and treated him with those marks of distinction which, as a regular customer, and one within the freemasonry of the trade, he had a right to claim. This lion, or landlord, for he was called both man and beast, by reason of his having instructed the artist who painted his sign to convey into the features of the lordly brute whose effigy it bore, as near a counterpart of his own face as his skill could compass and devise, was a gentleman almost as quick of apprehension and of almost as subtle a wit as the mighty John himself. But the difference between them lay in this, that whereas Mr Willet's extreme sagacity and acuteness were the efforts of unassisted nature, the lion stood indebted in no small amount to beer, of which he swigged such copious draughts that most of his faculties were utterly drowned and washed away, except the one great faculty of sleep, which he retained in surprising perfection. The creaking lion over the house door was, therefore, to say the truth, rather a drowsy, tame, and feeble lion; and as these social representatives of a savage class are usually of a conventional character, being depicted for the most part in impossible attitudes and of unearthly colours, he was frequently supposed by the more ignorant and uninformed among the neighbours to be the veritable portrait of the host as he appeared on the occasion of some great funeral ceremony or public mourning. "What noisy fellow is that in the next room?" said Joe, when he had disposed of his breakfast, and had washed and brushed himself. "A recruiting sergeant," replied the lion. Joe started involuntarily. Here was the very thing he had been dreaming of all the way along. "And I wish," said the lion, "he was anywhere else but here. The party make noise enough, but don't call for much. There's great cry there, Mr Willet, but very little wool. Your father wouldn't like 'em, I know." Perhaps not much under any circumstances. Perhaps if he could have known what was passing at that moment in Joe's mind, he would have liked them still less. "Is he recruiting for a fine regiment?" said Joe, glancing at a little round mirror that hung in the bar. "I believe he is," replied the host. "It's much the same thing, whatever regiment he's recruiting for. I'm told there an't a deal of difference between a fine man and another one when they're shot through and through." "They're not all shot," said Joe. "No," the lion answered, "not all. Those that are, supposing it's done easy, are the best off, in my opinion." "Ah!" retorted Joe, "but you don't care for glory." "For what?" said the lion. "Glory." "No," returned the lion, with supreme indifference, "I don't. You're right in that, Mr Willet. When glory comes here and calls for anything to drink and changes a guinea to pay for it, I'll give it him for nothing. It's my belief, sir, that the Glory's arms wouldn't do a very strong business." These remarks were not at all comforting. Joe walked out, stopped at the door of the next room, and listened. The sergeant was describing a military life. It was all drinking, he said, except that there were frequent intervals of eating and love-making. A battle was the finest thing in the world when your side won it, and Englishmen always did that. "Supposing you should be killed, sir?" said a timid voice in one corner. "Well, sir, supposing you should be," said the sergeant, "what then? Your country loves you, sir. His Majesty King George the Third loves you. Your memory is honoured, revered, respected. Everybody's fond of you and grateful to you. Your name's wrote down at full length in a book in the War Office. Damme, gentlemen, we must all die some time or another, eh?" The voice coughed, and said no more. Joe walked into the room. A group of half a dozen fellows had gathered together in the tap-room, and were listening with greedy ears. One of them, a carter in a smock frock, seemed wavering and disposed to enlist. The rest, who were by no means disposed, strongly urged him to do so, according to the custom of mankind, backed the sergeant's arguments, and grinned amongst themselves. "I say nothing, boys," said the serjeant, who sat a little apart, drinking his tea.